So this is, the interesting thing is I think that all of these, just like the conservation approaches and preservation approaches, I think everything begins to blur once you get into the project. And we've got all of these panels that are sort of, we've given them a category, but I think they all begin to blur together once we start getting into the nitty-gritty. We started talking about interpretation in the first panel and materials considerations in the first panel, and I think it all sort of comes together. But this panel, just for clarity's sake, is the interpretive approaches panel. And our moderator for today is David Dio. David was in the class of 2015, so he graduated last year. And he has been at Willowbank in many capacities. He was a student here. He worked here as a Young Canada Works student. He's told me he was a janitor here at one point. I think we've all been janitors at our own historic house museums at one point or another, I'm sure. David's gone on to become a heritage specialist, which is interesting. Maybe he'll tell us what that means, at Taylor Hazel Architects in Toronto. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Very nice to be back in the sort of spiritual home place of Willowbank. Heritage specialist is a suitably vague term, so I'll leave it, take it how you want it. To kick off our interpretation panel this afternoon, we'll be starting with Penny Young. Penny Young is a heritage planner and archaeologist. She is a member of the heritage team at Archaeological Research Associates, an archaeological and heritage consulting firm. She has over 20 years' experience working in government as a heritage planner, regional archaeologist, and archaeology database coordination. She is also quite well known to us at Willowbank, as she was the archaeological field director when we were doing archaeological work at this site, and she was my archaeology teacher in first year, and she continues to be a faculty associate. She has a BA in anthropology and English and an MA in anthropology from McMaster University. Penny?
Just press.
Apologies. Okay, that sounds brilliant. Can I just do the page down?
Yep.
Awesome. Hi, so it's a pleasure to be here today to be part of the discussion of the conservation of the and/or restoration of the Bright Parlour. And within this interpretive approaches panel, I felt I could share my knowledge of archaeology at Willowbank, so a bit of a different turn here in the discussions. And I've had the pleasure to be involved with Willowbank and its students many times here, and specifically in this room. So I know and love this place. From 2007 to 11, I had the immense pleasure and honor to co-direct archaeological investigations on these lands with Megan Brooks, with first-year students and local high school students. So it was a great experience, different people coming here and being involved in archaeology. And then also I did a bit of assessment work in terms of reviewing some trenching that was done for the utilities that were being run out to the barn. So that's another part of archaeology, the consulting sort of archaeological assessment work that I'll talk a little bit about too today. But sharing an archaeological perspective does at first make me feel a bit out of place in a discussion here around the room, as it's been more about what's below the ground as opposed to above the ground. But I do think that the below the ground perspective is important, and my work here at Willowbank has taught me this, because it was in 2011 when I met Julian Smith, and he was speaking about the work of the management plan for Willowbank and how it was important to have an archaeological perspective in part inform how the property was to be managed and conserved in the future. He spoke of Willowbank as a many-layered cultural landscape and how the indigenous occupational layers and the War of 1812 archaeological evidence provided vital insights as to what happened here on these lands and in the Kingston area, and it needed to be included in the management plan and in the school curriculum. And this was and is so exciting to me. to view archaeological material as playing a role in understanding, interpreting, conserving, and using the Willowbank estate for students and for visitors. Archaeological sites are many layered cultural landscapes. However, this experience of having archaeology inform historic or heritage building conservation and restoration is unfortunately not the typical work of archaeologists in Ontario or in general in North America. Archaeologists' usual role is one of removing archaeological sites prior to development, which locks us, unfortunately, in a mitigation ghetto rather than allowing us opportunities to inform positive decisions. In keeping with how archaeology in Ontario proceeds, most often prior to land development, this is how much of the archaeological material here at Willowbank was found. It was in 1999, the western portion of the property was to be developed as an estates residential subdivision. 6 large lots, a block of land set aside for road widening purposes, and a block to be added to adjacent lands to the east. An archaeological assessment firm was retained to conduct an assessment for the soon-to-be estates residential subdivision. And interestingly enough, the plans didn't even have Willowbank, the current building, on them, which is why it's so fun to include the one on the left. That's the hand-drawn version when the team of archaeologists came out and were doing the assessment. They drew on the drive and the actual house. So there wasn't even reference on the plan of subdivision. And sadly, that's not that horribly long ago, nor completely out of the ordinary. In 2000, the developer applied for a permit to demolish the house, prompting a local outcry to save the estate, and it was in part what led to the creation of the school. And it is the development-related archaeology, followed by public digs, that allows us to know and understand the long and remarkable history of Willowbank. So although the house that now stands and its current landscape are the focal point to the Willowbank National Historic Site and provincial designation, the larger property has significant archaeological deposits demonstrating 9,000 years of history. To date, 2 archaeological sites separated into 7 clusters or site areas have been located at Willowbank. So the portion in the darker gray to the east is what has been done with students and public digs, and to the west was the clusters that were located during the archaeological assessment prior to the development. And actually a lot of what saved the development in the west part is the developing company that was doing it were 2 individuals that were completely green, and so they essentially ran out of money. So, interesting, fascinating story. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to talk a little bit about the archaeological material found at these different clusters. So, and to begin, just to talk a little bit about our location, because as I found today, as I find every time when I arrive at Willowbank, it's just such a joy to arrive and be in the landscape. And every day, the sun seems to always be shining when I arrive at Willowbank. Or maybe it just is in my brain. On a hill above the lower Niagara River, in one of the oldest settled areas in the province, Willowbank has a location that is strategic, attracting settlement and land use over time and through time, both as the head of navigation on the lower Niagara River and as a point where the Aboriginal Trail following the base of the Niagara Escarpment came up here and crossed the Niagara River. People have lived on this landscape for thousands of years. It's 3 contiguous areas, essentially: an elevated ridge or tablelands upon which the house is situated, an open lawn that slopes down to the east fairly steeply to about Kingston Road, which provides an entirely different perspective on how this land was lived, and a steep ravine with valley lands containing an intermittent creek that drains into the Niagara River to the north. Like the estate home, these lands appear to be little altered since historic times. Registered archaeological sites, the extent of which are only partially known, cover approximately 1/3 of the property and document its occupation from archaic times through to the 19th century. So this is just a brief summary of, sadly a bit archaeological terminology-ish, as The Archaic period is actually a time period that archaeologists are being asked by indigenous communities to review the terminology, so I apologize for that. These various sites represent the successive generations of Willowbank inhabitants and display the transition in use of the land from early native fishers and hunters to native settlers who may have subsisted as early farmers, to the arrival of the Europeans, the War of 1812, and all the activities of the once bustling wharf at Kingston. And here's a brief description of what we know of these specific clusters. Cluster A, which is located at the far west sort of part of the property, is a campsite dating roughly to 9,000 years ago. This cluster of material appears to be early Archaic period temporary campsite. So with the orientation to the ravine, that would have been the important sort of feature for this group. A side notch point and over 1,100 pieces of chipstone tool materials were located here. And virtually all are of Onondaga chert and were quarried probably in the Fort Erie area. In addition to which, there's 7 musket balls and 1 gun flint. Cluster B, which is a little closer and closer to the driveway, is a ritual use site, which sadly is kind of the term archaeologists use when we're really not sure what the use of it was, but it's very unusual material. But it doesn't seem like a campsite or a house where there's a particular type of material that we can understand. It becomes ritual, but it dates to 3,000 to 2,000 years ago. And it probably is one of the most interesting clusters on the Willowbank property because virtually all the material that was found, the chipstone tools, are burnt, which is highly unusual. And they were then cached in a particular area and clearly meant for returning to. Very unusual, very different. And one of few sites in eastern North America as well as Ontario of this type, southern Ontario. Cluster C, I don't have any material to show you because it was just simply a simple find spot from 1,000 years ago, and there was some waste pre-contact chipstone material. Cluster D is over by the barn, and it is a European deposit of materials dating probably to the 1870s and onward. It has a tremendous amount of butchered animal bone, and it's suggesting that we suggest, the archaeologists that have looked at this material, we suggest that perhaps it was the dump location of kitchen material for the current house. Cluster E is the area where actually, oops, apologize, go back. Yeah. This is the area actually where the students excavated, and I was digging desperately to find student material, pictures of us out there, but I don't have any. Megan's probably got them. It was tested in 1999 and also in 2000 and excavated by students in 2007 to 8. And what makes it kind of a very unusual cluster is the fact of the flagstones were found essentially still in place as a paved area, perhaps for an outbuilding. And in addition, there were other construction related materials such as red brick and undressed limestone blocks. As the house is built of limestone, these were likely brought for construction here. What's interesting is they're undressed and larger than the stone walls, blocks in the stone walls. So it seems that this location, almost by the trees beside the parking lot, is where the construction material was brought and the work was done of fashioning the stones for the walls in 1833. And the red brick, we think, is associated maybe with an outbuilding such as a smokehouse on the property. And the most abundant cluster is the bright urban component we speak of, which is just to the south of the house here. And again, it also hasn't been fully investigated. And these are the lands that Alexander Hamilton inherited from his father's estate in 1824. They date to the artifacts date to the early settlement of Kingston, and most predate the construction and occupation of the house here, which is very interesting. So they have a sort of cutoff date of roughly 1840s. In addition to which, we found a tremendous quantity of construction materials and architectural remains, wrought nails, window glass. So what we now are suggesting is this is the occupation of the earlier house. That was the spot the Hamiltons lived in prior to and during the construction of this building, because their family was quite large, and prior to 1836 when they could move into the house. So they lived on the land, and this is quite likely their original homestead. In addition to which, there are Aboriginal components, and dating roughly to the time of the introduction of pottery in Ontario. Again, a really remarkable selection of artifacts. And the final cluster I'll speak about is the Hamilton Jarvis site, which is located down at the bottom of the hill, and it contained material from the mid-19th century, in addition to which it had Aboriginal artifacts, again, from 2,000 years ago onward, which all of this to be found on one property is just mind-boggling. And what's also very interesting is this portion of the property was likely inherited by Alexander Hamilton in 1809. Newspaper accounts and local knowledge suggest that the Kingston Post Office, one of the earliest in Upper Canada, was located along the eastern edge of the property in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So thanks for this opportunity to talk about the archaeology of the property. And now to move briefly from what is below the ground to above the ground, I just wanted to share maybe a couple thoughts around what an archaeological interpretive approach can teach us and how it can help us as we consider the conservation and restoration of the Bright Parlour. How does it inform conservation decisions? As archaeologists, the first thing that strikes me is as we approach each site, we anticipate it's a place potentially with many layers of human occupation, but they are hidden. We have no way of knowing. And archaeology also teaches us that there is great value in knowing each layer we encounter. So these are ideas, to my mind, that are transferable as we think about the Bright Parlour, as there have been many families and different occupants who have used this room, and the many layers bear witness to this. Also, as archaeologists, we are mindful that when we do field work, we actually destroy the site that we excavate. We destroy the layers we remove to get to what lies beneath them, and that we need to thoroughly document all the layers that we encounter. And where possible, we need to use the least destructive methods and measures, and to record each layer's cultural heritage value, because it is there. If this Bright Parlour was an archaeological site, we would document and record the layers we encounter, as each tells us an important story, which sometimes may only be evident far into the future. Thanks. Oh, and there's artifacts outside for people to look at, because as an archaeologist, we understand that people would rather look at the stuff than hear anyone speak. And so some of the material, a sample of material that was found here is in some of the display cases out in the hall.
Why did you choose this house? Just there's no history that there's stuff there. And
They was found because that's developing.
Thank you for that, Penny. Up next we have John Bonnett. John Bonnett is an intellectual historian and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Digital Humanities. His research interests include the writings of the communication theorist Harold Innis in the emerging domains of history and computing and humanities and computing. John was the principal developer of the 3D building project. This project had two objectives. The first was to teach students the means of recreating historic sites using 3D modeling. And the second, more fundamental purpose was to confront the theoretical point that historical models need to be distinguished from the objects to which they refer. John is currently developing a lab devoted to the emerging medium of augmented reality. And augmented reality, as I understand it, is similar to virtual reality, but whereas virtual reality creates a virtual environment to place objects within, augmented reality uses the present environment to impose the 3D models onto. As we've sort of discussed already, this is a very exciting development for this field, and if historians are to use this emerging medium, they will need to develop and test new conventions for narration, expression, and documentation. Over to John.
Thank you very much. As you may have gathered, I'm shifting from the material to the virtual here. What I want to talk to you about is some of the work that I've been doing. that is basically motivated by a question. And that question is we, in the past 5 to 10 years, I've noticed that the array of instruments that we have to express content with has just exploded, or at least it's gotten a whole lot bigger. So let's say 20 years ago, we had ready to hand 2 things, numbers and letters, to help us communicate content, represent it, and the like. Over the past 10 years, we now are in a situation where there are a variety of tools that are available. 3D modeling, 2D animation, even game engines now, where it is possible for you to obtain those instruments for free. There are free versions of high-end 3D modeling software packages like 3D Studio Max, or the version I use, which is SketchUp. There are game engine versions now that are free. We now have reasonably easy access to applications that would allow us to do stuff that I would have dreamed of in the 1970s. You know, I'm the first cohort that got hit gobsmacked by Star Wars in the 1970s, and I always wondered when we would reach a point where we would be able to do that ourselves, and we are now at that point where we can do that kind of thing ourselves. So what I want to talk to you about in terms of interpretation is a project I've been working on called the History Space Project. And my rationale in terms of linking it to the theme of this session is that, you know, I'm concerned primarily with the issue of design. You know, I just said we have these new expressive instruments that we have, like 3D models and so forth. Now, you know, here's the key problem. We have these new tools, but we can't put them in the container that we've traditionally used to disseminate content, which is the book or journal article or magazine or what have you. So we need a new container to basically disseminate, store, and distribute content. And my interest as a historian and as a digital humanist is to think about what is the nature of that container. What are the design features that within that container are going to be around to allow us to tell a story, to express content, to document content, and the like. What is it going to look like to express an interpretation in the platforms that are emerging now? How are we going to express that? What are we going to do? So let me show you a couple of things that I've been working on in the History Space Project where I've started to explore those questions. So as I indicated, you know, one of the drivers for the work is basically we have a lot of tools coming that are new and different. They're what I call the Topographic Revolution. So lots of easily accessible tools that have the qualities of having 2, 3, and 4 dimensions. They're also dynamic, meaning that they move. They're also autonomous, meaning that you have forms of expression now that are capable of performing behaviors without the direct manipulation of an author or programmer. Why that's important, you can create simulations of societies the way they operated and behaved in the past. They're also inexpensive. Now, the other things that are driving the work I do are things like the Geospatial Web. When we think of the internet, we tend to think of a web, and at each node in that web, it's occupied by web pages, basically sets of pages. That's going to change. That's in the process of change. Some of those nodes now are going to be occupied by globes, things like Google Earth and so forth. Another area that, another reason why it's important to start thinking about these things now are things like big data. We just have lots and lots of data, and we need tools and aggregations of tools that are going to be able to help us leverage it and express that content. And then a final reason why I've been involved in a lot of this work is that I'm a historian, and one of the things that I'm always constantly trying to figure out is how do I engage my students, how do I find new ways to represent the past to my students, how do I get them to be better, more critical thinkers. Now, a lot of the work that I've been doing, particularly in the History Space Project, has been motivated by an assumption in that with regard to the containers that we're going to be using in the future, those containers are going to be shaped by something that I call, or that is called convergence. And if you've got one of these things, you know exactly what I mean when I talk about convergence. Convergence is bringing a variety of tools into a new unity, a new aggregate to enhance the capabilities of users. So this smartphone, for example, is an aggregate of things like monitors, the keyboard, calendar, email, computer, all sorts of things, even including the phone. All of that stuff is brought together, and you know, my life's been changed, as has yours, I expect, by the emergence of these kind of things. I believe we're in a process now where scholars are going to be creating something very much like that. But it's going to aggregate a variety of other tools like game engines, which are, you know, what I call the word processors for virtual environments. They're going to bring together geographic information systems. So basically tools that take lists of data and put them on maps to help you find interesting and important patterns. They're going to involve the use of agent-based simulations, basically tools that are designed to figure out how societies worked in the past to represent their behavior and so forth. You can mimic anything from the behavior of ancient environments to the ancient military battles to ancient economies or historic economies, all sorts of things within the context of agent-based simulations. And all of that's likely going to be housed on something that looks like a Google Earth. So all of those things are being brought together. Scholars are talking about this process right now, and in fact you even have some initiatives such as the Crane Initiative in Toronto, which is studying ancient Byzantium, which is creating a project and an aggregate of tools very much like this. So the question I've asked is, okay, if that is the framework of our particular new container, how are we going to work within that? How are we going to do the basic things I talked about in terms of telling a story, expressing content, documenting content, and the like? You know, to put the matter succinctly, how do you footnote a building? Now, in terms of the work that I've done so far, one of the things we realized is if you have a framework like this, things are going to get very, very complex. Thinking about how, you know, 4 to 8 tools are going to work together simultaneously and telling stories and so forth, that's too much. So we have actually reduced our ambitions to thinking about what it would be like if we brought 2 tools together, GIS and game engines. And in our thought experiment, was we were thinking about what would happen if we brought those 2 together and we created modes of expression. We thought about 2 specific fields that have done the most to articulate their needs within history. With respect to computing, namely social history and architectural history. So within that particular framework, we have come up with 2 ideas that we think are going to have a bearing in how historical scholarly content is expressed in virtual environments in the future. The first is, the first innovation that we're proposing is something called a complex object. And here our idea is that when we have a new framework like this, we're going to be asking, as architectural historians or social historians, quite a lot from buildings. And buildings are going to perform functions very similar to what polygons do in GIS today. We're also making the prediction that when it comes to storytelling, the storytelling that is going to be operational a lot in environments like these are spatial narratives. Now, spatial narrative is something, if you've been to an amusement park, you've probably got an idea about what I mean. It's going from one point to another, and at a point where you stop, you receive new content. If you've been on a ride like the Pirates of the Caribbean, you know what a spatial narrative is. So with respect to that, then, what we did is we began, once we realized these were probably 2 things that were going to feature in our new containers, we then began work on figuring out what they would require, what they would entail. Now, with regard to models, we realized that our complex object models would need to, users would require 4 things from them. They would require a way for a model to show a relationship between a building and time. What that means is you want to be able to show a building at every stage in its life cycle, from its start to its end and every point in between. You need buildings that will show that they are aging. You will need buildings that show new constituents that are added or removed or modified. All of that needs to figure in your virtual environment. You also need buildings that will show a relationship between the building and the social data that is associated with it. This is where the connection with 2D polygons figures. So say, for example, you have a scenario where you want to look at a neighborhood. And as you're looking at that neighborhood, you want to know the demography of people within that neighborhood. You need that building to have the capacity to tell you if somebody was English living inside it, or Scottish, or Japanese, or whatever. And so buildings need to basically have the capacity to do that. They also need to show the relationship between the model and the primary source data that gave rise to it. This is one of the common features that you find in literatures devoted to virtual heritage, digital archaeology, and so forth. One of the chief concerns you're going to hear is people are concerned that when a person looks at a model of the past, whether it's a ziggurat from the Near East or a model of the Hamilton House here in Kingston, that model, we need to be able as scholars to communicate that this model is an interpretation of the past. And part of the problem is that when you get a model and it looks very photorealistic and it looks very pretty, people tend to view it as something that is it. You know, this is the real deal, this is the model. We need something that is basically going to communicate, no, you know, various parts of this model are based on real data, other parts are based on what we know about what architects were doing at the time, there are other parts that are based on the fact there had to be a pillar or something there or the building would have fallen down. But there are varying degrees of certainty with regard to buildings and their constituents and their models and so forth. We need to have a way to communicate that. And we also need to show the relationship between the modeler and the model. And what that means is, you know, any model potentially is going to have multiple versions. We want to know the versions, that the first version, the second version, the third version, the penultimate version, and the final version. We want to know the chain of reasoning that went to the creation, that led to the creation of that final product. We want to know the decision making, and we want to see the models that led to the final decision making and the final model. So we need to be able to show those final models. So to fit all these things, these requirements, we need models that are capable of changing their shape and surface appearance. And the way we're doing that is by conceiving of models as 3D matrices or matrices. So every model in the environments that we're going to be building are going to have basically versions that extend along 3 axes. So we'll have a temporal axis that shows every iteration of a model according to its life cycle. We'll have a version axis that shows the final version and then all previous ones that preceded it. And one thing that we're planning on doing is not only showing versions of model produced by a given team, but what we want to do is to create a capacity so that other teams who produce competing models elsewhere will be able to tap into that and bring that into a virtual world. The other thing that we're doing here is along this axis is the version axis, or I'm sorry, not the version axis, the expressive axis. This particular version here will deal with the issue of modeler confidence in particular pieces, whether it's based on data, architectural practice, or just other criteria. And then these nodes here will tie that building to social data, whether it's ethnicity or so forth. So to give you a sense of what that means, that model, it's in operation. If you were to do a query and say, tell me what your confidence is about various constituents of a building, it would create a multicolored rendition in symbolic format of that building, so you know that there's high confidence, for example, in this wall, say 50% confidence in this section, 30% confidence in that section, and so on. And then another thing would be, let's say, is the ethnicity of people who lived in that building. You would do a query, putting in, I want the final version, the way the building looked in 1905, and tell me its ethnicity. You would enter in a query. Our software then would then basically find the address that conforms to all 3 of those parameters within the matrix and bring it forward, and you would get a building featuring in red indicating that it was English. Just very quickly, I know I've got, 1 minute now?
About that.
Okay, so one thing I'll say finally is we're also working on creating what are tools that will support the creation of narratives using a metaphor called hubs and spokes. The basic idea here is that when we do things within virtual worlds, we're going to use a mode of work very much like the author Francois Rabelais, who was the founder of French literature. He used to go through the Paris market, find modes of expression that people who were selling things were using. He found things that were useful, he brought them in and incorporated them into the French novel. We're planning on doing something similar. There are all sorts of modes of a human activity where we have forms of expression out there that can be repurposed to our use, including things like hubs and spokes to help guide storytelling. Other forms like musical scales and so forth, those too can be used to support storytelling. We're going to use those things to help build storytelling or to construct stories and narratives in a virtual environment in a way that we hope will be simple, intuitive, and powerful. So with that, I'll thank you very much.
Thank you, John. A very fascinating tool. And lastly, I will reintroduce who you have already met and heard from many times today, Frank Magnano.